Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine something so tiny you can't even see it finding its way into your brain. And what's really unsettling is that scientists at the University of New Mexico, they've actually found these microscopic bits of plastic in human brains. Mm-hmm. And it looks like there's maybe more of it showing up over time. It makes you wonder what that's doing in there.
It really does. What's quite striking here is that this isn't just about plastic, piling up in landfills or oceans anymore. We're seeing pretty clear signs that these tiny particles are actually getting inside us.
Yeah.
And finding them in such a critical organ like the brain, well, it certainly makes you think seriously about what the long-term consequences could be.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're really getting into the world of microplastics. We're talking about those tiny pieces of plastic smaller than, say, a grain of rice. Mm-hmm. Basically what happens when all the bigger plastic stuff we use daily starts breaking down. Now, we know hearing about another potential health worry can feel like a lot. We get that.
Information overload is real. Totally. So our goal here is really to take all the science, the research, even some of the chatter online, and pull out the most important, easy to understand stuff about how microplastics might be affecting our health. And importantly, we also want to give you some simple, real things you can maybe do to cut down on how much you're exposed to.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to think of microplastics as something that's just spread everywhere. Mm-hmm. They aren't confined to one place. They've pretty much turned up in every part of our environment. We're talking oceans, rivers, soil.
Right.
The food we eat, the water we drink, tap or bottled, and kind of alarmingly, even the air we breathe and the dust that settles in our home.
It really hits home when you list it like that. And it's not just one kind of plastic either, is it?
No, not at all.
We're seeing things like polyethylene that's in tons of packaging, polypropylene, polystyrene, they're showing up all over. And what's concerning really is finding these microplastics inside people. They've been found in blood samples.
And early studies are even finding them in, urine, in placenta during pregnancy, and like we mentioned, even in brain tissue. Specifically the frontal cortex, the thinking part.
And that finding about the brain is particularly noteworthy. Some of those particles were incredibly small, like 200 nanometers or even tinier.
Wow.
To give you a sense of scale, that's much smaller than a red blood cell.
Okay.
Which helps explain how they might be able to slip past the body's natural defenses, like the blood-brain barrier.
So that raises the question, how are they getting in and moving around?
Right. There are many pathways. The most obvious one is when larger plastics break down, from sunlight, wear and tear, chemical activity. Mm. But we also have more direct sources. Think about the tiny plastic beads, the microbeads that used to be in face scrubs and things.
Oh yeah, those.
Thankfully, many are banned now, but also the tiny fibers that shed from our clothes during washing.
Synthetic fabrics, right.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly. Polyester, nylon, acrylics, also just household dust. Prepackaged foods, bottled water can contribute. Mm-hmm. Even things like tea bags, some contain plastic, or those synthetic waxes on fruits and vegetables.
I didn't even think about waxes.
Yeah, and tire wear is actually a big one too. The dust from car tires wearing down. And in the oceans, discarded fishing gear breaking down is a huge source.
Okay, so they're everywhere, and they're getting inside us. Now for the really important question, what could this actually be doing to our bodies?
Well, this is the area where scientists are still learning a lot, and it's important to be upfront. Most experts agree we don't yet have the full picture of all the health effects.
Okay.
However, what we've seen in studies with animals is definitely raising some red flags. There was a big review, almost 2,000 studies done for lawmakers in California. It pointed out that when animals ingest microplastics, it seems to lower their fertility and might even increase their risk of cancer, particularly in the digestive tract.
That sounds serious. And it's not just the plastic itself that's the issue, right? I remember reading they can sort of soak up other nasty stuff.
Exactly. That's a key concern. Microplastics have this knack for attracting and holding on to other harmful chemicals in the environment. Things like persistent organic pollutants, POPs, and heavy metals. These are toxins that stick around for a long time.
Right.
The worry is that microplastics, with their large surface area relative to their size, act like little sponges or magnets. They pick up these chemicals and then transport them into our bodies when we ingest the plastic, potentially increasing our exposure.
And one area getting a lot of attention seems to be our gut microbiome, all those tiny organisms in our digestive system that played such a huge role in keeping us healthy. Yeah. How are microplastics messing with that?
Yes, the gut microbiome research is fascinating. So think of your gut as this complex ecosystem, right? billions of bacteria helping digest food, provide nutrients, defend against pathogens. When this ecosystem gets out of balance, that's a state called dysbiosis, it can lead to problems. And studies are increasingly showing that microplastics can contribute to this dysbiosis. They seem to alter the types and proportions of bacteria living there.
Okay, so what kinds of changes are they actually seeing? Can you give some examples?
Sure. Well, some studies found that ingesting polyethylene, which is super common plastic, can lead to an increase in certain large groups of bacteria, like firmicutes and Bacteroides. Now, an imbalance between these groups has been linked to inflammation in other contexts.
Interesting.
And research in places like Indonesia actually found correlations between environmental microplastic levels and specific gut bacteria in people, even finding genes for plastic degrading enzymes.
Wow, so the bacteria might be adapting.
Potentially, yes. And in lab models simulating an infant's gut, polyethylene exposure led to an increase in potentially harmful bacteria, pathobionts like Dethiosulfovibrio and Enterobacteriaceae. At the same time, it reduced the production of butyrate, which is a fatty acid that's really important for gut health.
Okay, less of the good stuff, more of the bad stuff.
Basically, yeah. And similar findings are popping up in animal models too. Seabirds, mice exposed to microplastics, show these kinds of gut microbiome shifts.
So this imbalance in the gut, this dysbiosis,
Yeah.
why is that such a big deal? What can that lead to?
Well, connecting this to the bigger picture, a disrupted gut microbiome is increasingly linked to a whole host of health issues. Obvious things like gastrointestinal disorders, sure, but also potentially wider issues like systemic inflammation throughout the body, chronic diseases, and even effects on the gut-brain axis.
Ah, the gut-brain connection.
Exactly. There's this communication pathway, and the idea is that disrupting the gut could potentially lead to neuroinflammation, inflammation in the brain.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to think about. You mentioned some other early findings, too, beyond the gut.
Yes, preliminary findings. One study detected microplastics in liver tissue from individuals with cirrhosis, suggesting a possible link there. And another more recent study suggested microplastics might be associated with an elevated risk of atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, and more complex vascular issues in patients with acute coronary syndrome.
So heart health potentially, too.
Potentially. These are early days for that research, but it highlights that the effects might not be limited just to the digestive system.
Okay, this is all, well, it's a bit worrying, isn't it? So what can we actually do about this? Are there simple things, everyday things we can do to try and cut down our exposure?
Absolutely, and that's the good news. There are many small, practical changes people can make. The key is not to feel overwhelmed. You don't have to change everything overnight.
Right. Small steps. So let's start with, say, stuff we use on our bodies. Personal care products.
Yeah, good place to start. For things like soaps, lotions, cosmetics, definitely avoid anything that still lists microbeads, though, as we said, many are banned. Look for plastic-free cosmetics or packaging. Simple swaps, like using a bamboo toothbrush instead of plastic. You could try toothpaste tablets or even homemade toothpaste in a glass jar. Opting for bar soap often means less plastic packaging than liquid soap dispensers. And for families with babies, reusable cloth diapers are a great way to avoid the plastics and disposable ones.
Makes sense. What about clothes and laundry? I've heard synthetic clothes are a big source of fibers.
They are, yes. Those tiny plastic fibers are a significant contributor. So choosing natural fibers when you can, cotton, wool, silk helps.
Right.
A really effective step is installing a microfiber filter on your washing machine's outlet hose. It catches a lot of those fibers before they go down the drain. You can also use special laundry bags, sometimes called Guppy Friend bags or similar, that trap fibers inside when you wash synthetic items.
Oh, interesting. Okay, laundry sorted. What about just around the house, general cleaning?
For the home, think about natural fiber carpets and curtains if you're replacing them. Vacuuming and dusting regularly is key, especially if your vacuum has a good HEPA filter, which can trap those really fine particles, including plastic dust.
HEPA filter, got it.
And for cleaning itself, try using natural cleaners like vinegar or baking soda. Store them in glass or reused containers, not new plastic bottles. Use natural fiber sponges or cloths instead of plastic ones. And maybe switch to wooden or bamboo cutting boards instead of plastic.
Okay, that all sounds doable. And then there's food and drink. That feels like a potentially big exposure route.
It certainly can be. Cooking at home more often, using fresh whole ingredients, generally means less reliance on processed foods and plastic packaging. That's a big one.
Yeah.
Using reusable water bottles, preferably glass or stainless steel, is crucial. And filtering your tap water can help reduce potential microplastics from the water system.
So filtered tap over bottled water.
Generally, yes. Bottled water itself can be a source of microplastics from the bottle and the bottling process. Filtered tap water is often a better bet for reducing plastic intake and waste.
Good tip.
If you drink tea, go for loose leaf tea instead of potentially plastic-containing tea bags. Choose fresh produce that isn't prepackaged in plastic whenever possible.
Right, less packaging.
Try to reduce consumption of highly processed and prepackaged foods overall. With seafood, ensure it's properly clean and maybe avoid eating shellfish whole, where the digestive tract is included. And be mindful of those synthetic waxes sometimes used on fruits and vegetables. Washing them well is always a good idea.
That's a lot of really helpful, practical advice. I also remember reading about a microplastics researcher sharing what they personally do.
Yes, that's right. One researcher specifically mentioned using glass or steel water bottles, storing food in glass containers whenever possible, gradually replacing plastic ones, not throwing everything out at once.
Gradual changes.
Exactly. And they also emphasized using a vacuum with a HEPA filter. For bought cleaning products, they suggested looking for the EPA's Safer Choice label. Another interesting point they made was trying to eat lower on the food chain, more grains, fruits, vegetables.
Why is that?
Because contaminants, including plastic-associated chemicals, can bioaccumulate, meaning they build up in organisms as you go up the food chain. So eating lower down might reduce exposure to those accumulated substances.
Makes sense.
And while acknowledging it's not accessible for everyone, they mentioned that choosing organic produce can reduce pesticide exposure, some of which involve plastics in their application or formulation.
So it really sounds like making a few mindful choices can add up. But is it fair to put all the burden on individuals? What about the bigger picture?
That's a really critical point. Individual actions matter, they empower people, but they can't solve the whole problem. It's pretty clear that we need governmental regulation to tackle widespread contamination in water, food supplies, and consumer goods. The burden shouldn't fall solely on consumers trying to navigate this.
Right.
We need systemic changes. Improving waste management is huge. The classic reduce, reuse, recycle, but also recover, finding value from waste. Policies like bans on specific single-use plastics or implementing effective mandatory waste sorting like they have in some places can make a real difference on a larger scale.
And what about new technologies or future directions? Is anything promising on the horizon?
Well, research is definitely ongoing, both into the health effects and potential solutions. You might see headlines about, say, companies claiming they can clean microplastics from blood.
Yeah, I think I saw something like that.
But it's important to remember, as we've said, most experts agree we're still figuring out the full health implications, so claims about solutions need careful scrutiny. There's also a lot of development in bio-based or biodegradable plastics as potential alternatives.
Those the answer.
It's complex. Those terms can be confusing or even misleading sometimes. A bio-based plastic is made from plants but might not break down easily. A biodegradable plastic might only break down under specific industrial composting conditions, not necessarily in the ocean or soil. So they're part of the conversation, but not a simple magic bullet.
Right. Not straightforward. Okay, so to wrap things up then, what are the main things you really want our listeners to take away from this deep dive today?
Okay, I think the key takeaways are, first, microplastics are, undeniably pervasive. They're in our environment and increasingly detected inside our bodies. Second, while the full health effects are still under investigation, emerging research raises valid concerns, particularly regarding gut health, inflammation, and potentially other systemic issues. Pay attention to this space.
Mm-hmm.
Third, and this is the empowering part, there are practical, achievable steps you can take in your daily life to reduce your personal exposure. Focus on gradual, sustainable changes.
Don't get overwhelmed.
Exactly. And finally, remember, this is a large-scale environmental issue that requires broader solutions beyond individual actions involving industry responsibility and government regulation.
That's a really clear summary, and it definitely gives us all some food for thought, maybe plastic-free food for thought. Considering how these tiny plastics are increasingly part of us, it raises a big question. What responsibility do we all share, individuals, companies, governments, in tackling this growing environmental and health challenge? We'd genuinely love to hear what you think. Head down to the comments section, let us know. What steps are you considering? What resonated with you? Or what other questions do you have about microplastics? Let's keep this important conversation going.